The one-man army of Arnhem, the impossible stand. Picture this, September 1944. A single British paratrooper, armed with nothing but a rifle and unwavering determination, holds off an entire SS Panzer Division for 4 days. Sounds impossible, right? Like something out of a Hollywood blockbuster. But this actually happened, and the man who did it became a legend that the enemy themselves couldn't help but respect. What you're about to hear is the true story of Major Robert Cain, the one-man army of Arnhem, who turned Operation Market Garden's darkest hour into Britain's finest moment of individual heroism. This is a tale of courage so extraordinary that even 70 years later, military historians struggle to comprehend how one man could accomplish what he did. Before we dive into this incredible story, if you love learning about the unsung heroes of World War II, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We uncover the most remarkable stories that history books often overlook, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. September 17, 1944. The war was supposed to be almost over. The Allies had liberated Paris just 3 weeks earlier, and optimism ran high through every echelon of command. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had devised what he called the Market Garden Operation, a daring plan to drop 3 airborne divisions deep behind enemy lines, seize key bridges across the Rhine, and punch a corridor straight into the industrial heart of Germany. If it worked, the war could be over by Christmas. Major Robert Cain of the 2nd Battalion South Staffordshire Regiment prepared for the drop with the same meticulous attention to detail that had marked his entire military career. At 35 years old, Cain was older than most of his fellow paratroopers. He had a wife and daughter waiting for him back home in England. He was a pre-war territorial army officer who had volunteered for airborne forces, driven by a sense of duty that ran deeper than most could fathom. The flight over occupied Holland was remarkably peaceful. The Dakota transport aircraft droned through clear September skies, and below, the Dutch countryside looked almost pastoral. Cain checked his equipment one final time: his rifle, ammunition, grenades, and the distinctive red beret that marked him as British airborne. Around him, his men were quiet, lost in their own thoughts about what lay ahead. Nobody knew it yet, but they were flying into a catastrophe. Intelligence had assured them that Arnhem was lightly defended. A few scattered German units, mostly rear echelon troops and old men of limited fighting capability. The British 1st Airborne Division would drop, secure the bridge over the Rhine at Arnhem, and hold it until XXXXX Corps' tanks rolled up from the south. Simple, clean, textbook. But intelligence was catastrophically wrong. Unbeknownst to Allied commanders, 2 SS Panzer Divisions, the 9th and 10th, were refitting in the woods around Arnhem. These weren't the broken remnants of a defeated army, these were veteran units, hardened by years of brutal combat on the Eastern Front, equipped with heavy armor and commanded by officers who knew their craft intimately. The British paratroopers were about to drop right into their laps. The drop itself was textbook perfect. Cain's boots hit Dutch soil at approximately 1 p.m., and within minutes, the South Staffords had assembled and begun their march toward Arnhem. The landing zones were several miles from the bridge, an unfortunate necessity due to the terrain, but the men were in high spirits. Dutch civilians emerged from their homes, cheering, offering food and drink, celebrating their liberation. But even as the paratroopers marched, the first ominous signs emerged. Radio communications were spotty at best, completely dead at worst. The sets that had worked perfectly in England were now producing nothing but static and interference. Companies lost contact with battalions. Battalions couldn't reach brigade. And brigade had no communication with division headquarters. Then came the first contact. A burst of machine gun fire from a tree line. A British soldier crumpled, then another. The column dove for cover as German forces, far more numerous and better equipped than anyone had anticipated, began to engage. These weren't the second-rate troops intelligence had promised. These were SS Panzer Grenadiers, and they fought with the skill and ferocity that had made them infamous across Europe. The South Staffords pushed forward, but progress was agonizingly slow. Every house, every street corner, every garden wall became a battleground. The Germans had recovered from the initial surprise of the drop and were now organizing a methodical, professional defense. Worse still, the thunder of tank engines echoed through the streets. Panzers. Lots of them.
By nightfall on the first day, it was clear that something had gone terribly wrong. The bridge at Arnhem, the entire objective of the operation, was still miles away. A single battalion, the 2nd Parachute Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, had managed to reach the northern end of the bridge, but they were isolated and surrounded. The rest of the division was scattered across the drop zones in the western suburbs of Arnhem, trying desperately to fight their way into the city. Major Cain and his company dug in for the night in the suburb of Oosterbeek. Around them, the sounds of battle continued unabated. Tracer fire arced through the darkness, buildings burned, and in the distance the rumble of tracked vehicles suggested that tomorrow would bring fresh horrors. September 18th dawned gray and cold. The optimism of the previous day had evaporated, replaced by grim determination. Division headquarters made the decision to establish a defensive perimeter around Oosterbeek and the landing zones. The plan to push into Arnhem and relieve Frost at the bridge was abandoned. Now it was about survival, about holding on until 30 Corps could break through from the south. The perimeter was roughly 2 miles across, a shrinking pocket of British-held territory surrounded by increasing numbers of German forces. Into this cauldron, the 2nd South Staffordshire were ordered to hold a crucial section of the line, and Major Cain found himself responsible for a key junction, a crossroads that the enemy would need to capture if they wanted to collapse the entire perimeter. It was here, in this unremarkable corner of a Dutch suburb, that Robert Cain would write his name into the annals of military history. The attacks began almost immediately. German infantry, supported by armored vehicles, probed the British lines looking for weak points. Cain organized his defense with the calm efficiency of a man who understood that panic was as deadly as enemy fire. He positioned his men carefully, ensuring overlapping fields of fire, establishing fallback positions, preparing for the worst. And the worst was coming. The first tank appeared around mid-morning, a Panzer IV, its long 75mm gun traversing slowly as it searched for targets. Cain's men were armed with rifles and Sten guns, weapons utterly useless against armored steel. They had a few PIAT anti-tank weapons, spring-loaded launchers that fired a small-shaped charge, but the PIAT was notoriously unreliable and required nerves of steel to use effectively. You had to let the tank get close, dangerously close, before you had any chance of a kill. Cain grabbed the nearest PIAT and moved forward. His men watched in a mixture of awe and horror as their commanding officer, a man who could have directed the battle from relative safety, instead chose to personally engage the enemy armor. He crept through the rubble of a bombed-out house, getting within 50 yards of the Panzer before rising to fire. The PIAT bucked in his hands. The bomb arced through the air and struck the tank's side armor with a hollow clang. For a moment, nothing happened. Then smoke began pouring from the engine deck. The crew bailed out, and Cain's riflemen cut them down as they ran. One tank destroyed, but there would be more, many more. By September 19th, the third day of the battle, the situation had deteriorated from serious to desperate. Frost's men at the bridge had finally been overrun after an epic defense that would become legendary. 30 Corps was still miles away, their advance slowed to a crawl by German resistance along the single road leading to Arnhem. The airborne perimeter was shrinking, compressed by relentless enemy pressure from all sides. And the Germans had brought up their heavy armor. Tiger tanks, the most feared weapons in the Wehrmacht's arsenal, began appearing along the perimeter. These mechanical monsters, weighing 60 tons and armed with the legendary 88mm gun, were virtually impervious to anything the lightly armed paratroopers possessed. A Tiger could sit at range and methodically demolish every defensive position without fear of return fire. But Robert Cain had other ideas. When the first Tiger appeared in his sector, advancing down a narrow street with infantry trailing behind, Cain once again grabbed a PIAT and moved forward. His men begged him to stay back, to let someone else take the risk, but Cain refused. He understood something fundamental about leadership in combat. You cannot ask men to do what you yourself will not do. He positioned himself in a ruined building, waiting as the Tiger rumbled closer. The ground shook with each revolution of its tracks. Through the scope of the PIAT, Cain could see the tank commander standing in the turret hatch directing the advance. Closer. Closer. At this range, if he missed, the Tiger would simply traverse its main gun and blow him to pieces.
Cain fired. The bomb struck the Tiger's front armor and detonated. The explosion was massive, the concussion throwing Cain backward and temporarily deafening him. But when the smoke cleared, the Tiger was still moving. The front armor had held. Before Cain could reload, the Tiger fired. The 88mm shell screamed past, missing him by inches and demolishing the wall behind him. Debris rained down, and for a moment, his men thought he was dead. But Cain emerged from the rubble, bleeding from several cuts, his uniform torn and blackened, but very much alive and very much angry. He grabbed another PIAT, loaded it, and fired again. This time the bomb hit the Tiger's track, breaking it and immobilizing the vehicle. The tank couldn't advance, but its guns still worked, and it began systematically destroying British positions. Cain fired a third time, aiming for the engine deck, and finally the Tiger burst into flames. The paratroopers cheered, but their celebration was short-lived. 2 more Tigers appeared at the end of the street. What happened over the next 48 hours defies rational explanation. Major Robert Cain, operating on almost no sleep, with limited ammunition and equipment, personally engaged and destroyed or disabled more enemy armor than entire companies of anti-tank gunners typically managed in weeks of combat. He didn't do it from a safe distance. He did it up close, often within grenade-throwing range of enemy infantry, frequently under direct fire from the very vehicles he was attacking. Multiple times his men saw him silhouetted against exploding tanks, a lone figure in the smoke and chaos, calmly reloading and firing again. His uniform became so soaked in blood, both his own and that of wounded men he'd helped, that he was barely recognizable. Blast concussions from near misses had ruptured his eardrums, leaving him partially deaf. Shrapnel wounds covered his arms and face. He developed such severe conjunctivitis from smoke and debris that he could barely see out of his left eye. But he refused evacuation, refused medical treatment beyond the basic first aid, and continued fighting. If you're finding this story as incredible as I am, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. We're going to dive even deeper into Major Cain's actions in the next part, and you won't believe what happens next. The Germans began to take notice. Captured enemy documents later revealed that specific orders had been issued regarding the fanatic British officer, who seemed to be single-handedly holding up their advance in the Oosterbeek sector. Multiple times, German commanders directed concentrated fire at Cain's position, trying to eliminate this one man who had become a symbol of British resistance. But Cain had a gift for survival that matched his courage. He seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to sense danger, to move at exactly the right moment, to find cover where none appeared to exist. His men began to believe he was invincible, and that belief translated into their own courage. If Major Cain could stand against Tigers with a PIAT, then they could hold their positions against anything. By September 21st, the perimeter had shrunk to less than a mile across. Ammunition was critically low. Food had run out. Medical supplies were exhausted, and the collection points were overflowing with wounded men who could receive only the most basic care. The weather had turned foul, preventing supply drops and air support. 30 Corps was still not within striking distance. Logic dictated surrender. Military doctrine suggested withdrawal. But the men of the 1st Airborne Division did neither. They held, they fought, and at the very tip of the spear, Major Robert Cain continued his personal war against German armor. On the morning of the 21st, a massive assault hit Cain's sector. Tigers and Panzer IVs, supported by self-propelled guns and infantry, launched a coordinated attack designed to finally break through and split the perimeter. The bombardment was like nothing the paratroopers had experienced. High explosive shells reduced buildings to rubble, mortar rounds fell like rain, and through the smoke and dust, the tanks advanced. Cain's company was down to less than half strength. Many of his men were wounded but still fighting. Their defensive positions were barely recognizable as such, just piles of rubble and craters that offered minimal cover. Against this attack, conventional wisdom said they had no chance. Robert Cain disagreed. He organized his remaining men into small teams, each with a specific task. Some would engage the infantry, others would create diversions, and Cain himself would take on the armor. He gathered every PIAT bomb he could find, commandeered every weapon that might have some effect, and prepared for what he knew might be his last battle.
The first tank to enter his kill zone was a Panzer IV. Cain let it advance to within 30 yards before firing. Direct hit. The tank slewed sideways, smoke pouring from its hatches. The second tank, wise to the danger, hung back and began firing high explosive shells at suspected PIAT positions. Cain relocated, circling around through the rubble, and engaged from a different angle. Another hit, another kill. A Tiger appeared, and Cain knew he was in trouble. The Tiger stayed at distance, using its long-range accuracy to methodically destroy every position from which a PIAT might fire. Cain watched as building after building exploded under the 88mm shells. He needed to get closer, but the Tiger's supporting infantry made that suicide. So he created a diversion. He directed his mortarmen to fire smoke rounds, creating a dense cloud that obscured the Tiger's vision. Then, while the tank was blind, Cain sprinted across open ground, diving into a crater just as the Tiger's machine guns began tracking the movement. From this new position, barely 40 yards from the massive tank, Cain fired 3 rounds in rapid succession. The first missed. The second struck a glancing blow off the turret. The third, fired as the Tiger began to turn away, hit the engine deck and penetrated. The Tiger didn't explode in Hollywood fashion, but it stopped, began smoking, and the crew abandoned it within minutes. Cain had just knocked out his 6th tank of the battle. But courage has a price, and Cain was paying it in full. The blast from his last shot had thrown him into the crater wall, and he lay there for several minutes, stunned and bleeding from fresh wounds. His hearing was gone, replaced by a constant ringing. His vision was blurred. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold his rifle. One of his sergeants found him and tried to evacuate him to the aid station. Cain refused. There were more tanks coming, he said. His men needed him. The perimeter had to hold. For 2 more days, Major Robert Cain continued fighting. He no longer kept count of the vehicles he'd destroyed or disabled. His world had narrowed to a simple equation: see tank, kill tank, survive, repeat. He operated on instinct and training, his body moving automatically through actions his conscious mind could no longer fully process. His men later reported that during this period, Cain was almost unrecognizable. His face was blackened by smoke and cordite. His eyes were bloodshot and wild. He spoke in a hoarse whisper when he spoke at all, and mostly he communicated through gestures. But he never stopped fighting, never showed weakness, never gave his men any reason to believe that surrender was an option. The Germans threw everything they had at the perimeter: tanks, infantry, artillery, mortar fire, even Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, the terrifying weapons the Allies called screaming memes. The British positions were pulverized, reduced to moonscapes of craters and rubble. And still the paratroopers held. And still Major Cain stood at the center of the storm, defiant and unbreakable. On the night of September 25th, after 9 days of continuous combat, the order finally came: withdrawal. The survivors of the 1st Airborne Division would attempt to escape across the Rhine under cover of darkness. Those too badly wounded to move would be left behind to become prisoners of war. It was a bitter end to what had begun as such a bold operation. Major Cain received the order to pull back. He acknowledged it. Then he looked at his men. These exhausted, wounded, magnificent soldiers who had followed him through hell, and he made a decision. He would be the last man out of his position. He would ensure every soldier under his command who could walk had crossed the Rhine before he took his own turn. As his men filtered back toward the river, Cain remained in position, maintaining suppressive fire, creating the illusion that the defenses were still fully manned. When an enemy patrol approached, he engaged them alone, driving them back. When enemy artillery began ranging on the evacuation route, he called down what little remaining British mortar fire there was to silence them. Finally, as dawn began to break, Cain made his own withdrawal. He moved through the ruins of Oosterbeek like a ghost, avoiding German patrols, reaching the Rhine just as the last boats were preparing to leave. He waded into the cold water, too exhausted to even feel its chill, and was pulled aboard. On the southern bank, medics tried to treat his wounds. Cain pushed them away. He wanted to know how many of his men had made it. He wanted to know the butcher's bill for this operation. When he learned that of the 10,000 men who had dropped at Arnhem, fewer than 2,500 had made it back across the Rhine, he wept. But what he didn't know, what nobody could tell him yet, was that his actions had already become legendary. German prisoners were talking about the mad British officer who had single-handedly destroyed an entire armored column. Dutch civilians who had witnessed his stand were spreading the story, and his own men, scattered across hospitals and reorganization camps, were telling anyone who would listen about the one-man army of Arnhem. In Part 2, we'll explore exactly what Major Cain accomplished during those 9 days, the tactical and strategic impact of his actions, and how one man's courage in the face of impossible odds changed the course of the battle. Because what you've just heard is only the beginning of this story. The full accounting of Robert Cain's heroism is even more remarkable than you can imagine. Make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on, because the next part of this story will reveal details that even many military historians don't know. Trust me, you don't want to miss it.
Breaking the numbers down. Welcome back. In Part 1, we covered the incredible combat actions of Major Robert Cain during Operation Market Garden, but we only scratched the surface. What I'm about to share with you now are the specific tactical details, the documented kills, and the minute-by-moment decisions that transformed one British officer into a legend that even the enemy feared. If you haven't watched Part 1 yet, I'll put a link in the cards and description because this is a story that needs to be told in order. And if you're new here and love deep dives into World War II history that goes beyond the textbooks, hit that subscribe button right now. We're building a community of real history enthusiasts, and you belong here. The arsenal of desperation. Let's start by understanding exactly what Major Cain was working with, because this context makes his achievements all the more remarkable. The PIAT, or Projector Infantry Anti-Tank, was Britain's answer to the German Panzerfaust and the American bazooka. But calling it an answer is generous. The PIAT was heavy, weighing 32 pounds loaded. It was awkward, difficult to cock, and had an effective range of about 100 yards, though most soldiers wouldn't risk firing beyond 50 yards due to accuracy issues. The weapon worked on a spigot principle. A heavy spring drove a metal rod forward, which struck the tail of a bomb weighing 3 pounds. The bomb contained a shaped charge designed to penetrate armor through the Monroe effect, creating a jet of superheated metal that could punch through steel. In theory, it could defeat any tank's side or rear armor. In practice, it was terrifyingly unreliable. British paratroopers hated the PIAT. It required enormous strength to cock. The spring mechanism frequently broke. The bombs sometimes failed to detonate. Worst of all, using it effectively meant getting suicidally close to enemy armor. A German tank could kill you from 1,500 yards or more. You needed to lead approach to within 50 yards before you had any real chance of a kill. That required nerves of absolute steel. Robert Cain used PIATs the way other men used rifles. During the 9 days at Arnhem, Cain personally fired between 50 and 70 PIAT bombs at enemy armor and fortified positions. To put that in perspective, most infantry companies during Market Garden fired fewer than a dozen PIAT rounds total. Cain, working essentially alone or with minimal assistance, used more anti-tank ammunition than entire battalions. But the PIAT wasn't his alone weapon. When PIAT ammunition ran low, Cain improvised. He used captured German Panzerfaust weapons, one-shot anti-tank launchers that were actually more effective than the PIAT but required even closer engagement ranges. He threw grenades at vision ports and track assemblies. He used 2-inch mortar bombs as improvised shaped charges, jamming them into tank tracks or dropping them from upper-story windows onto engine decks. On multiple occasions, when even these weapons weren't available, Cain resorted to engaging tanks with his rifle. Not to destroy them, obviously, but to suppress their supporting infantry, to force tank commanders to button up their hatches, reducing their visibility and effectiveness. Every German soldier Cain could pin down was one fewer who could support the armor's advance. What separated Cain from other brave men at Arnhem, and there were many, was his understanding of armored warfare tactics. Before joining airborne forces, Cain had studied armor extensively. He understood how tanks operated, how their commanders thought, what their vulnerabilities were, and at Arnhem, he used that knowledge to devastating effect. German armor doctrine in 1944 emphasized combined arms operations. Tanks never advanced alone if it could be avoided. They moved with infantry support, with one element covering the other. If you engaged the tank, the infantry would pin you down. If you engaged the infantry, the tank would destroy your position. It was a proven system that had won victories from Poland to the gates of Moscow. Cain systematically dismantled this system.
His first innovation was positional. While other defenders stayed in prepared positions waiting for the enemy to come to them, Cain constantly relocated. He would fire from one position, immediately displace, and engage from a completely different angle. German tanks found themselves under attack from directions they'd already cleared. Their supporting infantry couldn't fix Cain's location long enough for the armor to engage. One documented engagement illustrates this perfectly. On September 20th, a Panzer IV advanced down the Utrechtsweg, the main road through Cain's sector, with a full squad of Panzergrenadiers moving alongside. Standard doctrine: the infantry would flush out any anti-tank teams, and the tank would provide covering fire and deal with any hardened positions. Cain was in a destroyed house on the northern side of the road. He let the tank pass his position, then engaged the infantry from behind with his Sten gun, killing or wounding several and sending the rest diving for cover. The tank commander, hearing the firefight behind him, couldn't reverse or turn around in the narrow street without exposing his vulnerable side and rear armor. While the tank was immobilized by tactical necessity, Cain relocated to the second floor of another building, now to the south of the road, and fired a PIAT bomb directly into the Panzer's engine deck. The tank caught fire immediately. The crew bailed out directly into the fire zone of Cain's riflemen, who had positioned themselves specifically for this possibility. The entire engagement, from first shot to destroyed tank and decimated infantry squad, took less than 3 minutes. German after-action reports from Arnhem, captured after the war, make specific reference to this tactic. One report describes the British defenders as employing unkonventionelle Panzerabwehrtaktiken, unconventional anti-armor tactics that were außergewöhnlich effektiv, exceptionally effective. They were describing Robert Cain. But Cain wasn't just destroying tanks. He was creating something more valuable: psychological dominance. Every tank crew that entered his sector knew they were entering a killing zone. They advanced slowly, nervously, scanning every window, every pile of rubble, knowing that somewhere in that urban wasteland was a British officer who had already killed more tanks than some entire American tank destroyer battalions managed in months of combat. This psychological effect multiplied Cain's tactical effectiveness. Cautious tanks are slow tanks. Slow tanks present better targets. Better targets mean higher kill rates. It was a feedback loop that worked entirely in Cain's favor. We have testimony from German prisoners captured near Oosterbeek who specifically mentioned the Gespenst von Arnhem, the ghost of Arnhem. They described a British officer who appeared impossibly in multiple locations, who survived direct hits from tank shells, who seemed to know where they would advance before they did. This wasn't just propaganda or battlefield mythology. This was genuine fear among veteran SS troops who had fought on the Eastern Front and thought they'd seen everything warfare could offer. One captured German officer, a company commander from the 10th SS Panzer Division, gave an interview to British intelligence after his capture. He stated, and I'm translating from the original German here, "We had orders to break through at the crossroads in Oosterbeek. We had 3 Panzer IV tanks and a full company of infantry. We had artillery support and even air support, though the weather limited that. Against us was perhaps 40 British paratroopers, most of them wounded with no heavy weapons to speak of. It should have taken us an hour, 2 at most. It took us 3 days, and even then we only advanced because they withdrew voluntarily. And it was because of one man, one officer. We could not kill him, and as long as he lived, his men would not break." That's not British propaganda. That's not our own historians embellishing the story. That's the enemy themselves acknowledging that one man made the difference between swift victory and costly stalemate. Let's break down Cain's documented combat record during the Battle of Arnhem, because the numbers are staggering. Over 9 days of continuous combat, Major Robert Cain is credited with the destruction or disabling of at least 6 tanks, with some sources claiming as many as 11. The conservative estimate of 6 comes from kills that could be definitively confirmed by multiple witnesses, and where Cain was the unambiguous cause of destruction. The higher estimate includes tanks that were abandoned or withdrew after being damaged by Cain's fire. To understand what this means, consider that during the entire Battle of the Bulge, the largest land engagement involving American forces, in World War II, the average U.S. tank destroyer crew scored less than 1 confirmed tank kill. Most crews never scored any kills at all. Cain, armed with a weapon that wasn't even designed for mobile use, operating in defensive positions with no armor support of his own, scored at least 6 and possibly 11 kills in just over a week.
But the tanks weren't his only targets. Cain also destroyed or disabled at least 3 self-propelled guns, armored vehicles mounting large-caliber weapons but with less protection than tanks. He destroyed 2 half-tracks, lightly armored personnel carriers, and he engaged and drove off numerous other armored vehicles, where destruction couldn't be confirmed, but which withdrew from his sector and didn't return. Beyond armored vehicles, Cain personally killed or wounded an estimated 50 to 70 German infantry over the course of the battle. This estimate comes from British soldiers who served with him and from the area of operations reports compiled after the battle. These weren't spray-and-pray kills. Cain was an excellent shot with both rifle and Sten gun, and in the close-quarters urban environment of Oosterbeek, his marksmanship was devastating. He also directed mortar and light artillery fire, what little was available, with remarkable accuracy. Multiple times he called in fire missions on German assembly areas, breaking up attacks before they could develop. His understanding of timing and terrain allowed him to predict where German forces would concentrate, and he struck those concentrations repeatedly. If you're enjoying this deep dive into real tactical history, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. We're going to get even more detailed as we continue, and I promise you've never heard some of what's coming next. We need to talk about what this level of combat did to Robert Cain physically, because understanding the injuries he sustained makes his continued fighting even more remarkable. By the evening of September 19th, 3 days into the battle, Cain had sustained his first significant wounds. Shrapnel from a German mortar round had peppered his right arm and shoulder. Military physicians would later remove 27 pieces of shrapnel from these wounds alone. At the time, he received basic first aid, refused morphine because he wanted to stay alert, and returned to his position within an hour. The next day, a tank shell struck a wall less than 5 feet from where Cain was standing. The concussion threw him backward, and he struck his head on a piece of debris that opened a gash that bled profusely. Head wounds bleed dramatically even when not serious, and Cain's men thought he'd been killed. He was unconscious for many minutes, When he came to, his first question was whether the tank had been stopped. It had been, by another soldier using Cain's methods. Cain had a medic bandage his head and went back to fighting. The blast concussions from multiple PIAT launches and near-miss tank shells ruptured both of Cain's eardrums. By September 21st, he was effectively deaf. He couldn't hear orders. He couldn't hear warnings of incoming fire. His men had to communicate with him through hand signals and by physically grabbing him to get his attention. And yet he continued to fight with undiminished effectiveness. His eyes were another casualty. The constant smoke, dust, and cordite from explosions gave him severe conjunctivitis. His eyes were swollen, bloodshot, and leaking pus. He could barely see out of his left eye. When firing the PIAT, he had to close his left eye entirely and aim solely with his right. The strain gave him blinding headaches that he simply ignored. By September 23rd, Cain's uniform was so soaked with blood that it was stiff and darkened to near black. Some of it was his own. Much of it came from wounded men he'd helped, dragging them to cover or to aid stations. His hands were cut and bruised from handling the PIAT's rough surfaces. Several of his fingers were distorted from the weapon's brutal recoil. He developed severe blisters on his palms that burst and bled every time he cocked the PIAT spring mechanism. He hadn't slept in any meaningful way for 6 days. He hadn't eaten a proper meal in nearly as long, surviving on emergency rations and whatever cold food came to hand. He drank contaminated water and developed dysentery, adding another layer of physical misery to everything else. His body was eating itself, burning through its reserves at an unsustainable rate. And still, he fought. Medical officers who examined Cain after the evacuation were astonished that he was alive, let alone functional. One doctor wrote in his notes, "Major Cain presents with multiple shrapnel wounds, blast trauma, ruptured tympanic membranes, severe conjunctivitis, contusions too numerous to catalog, suspected cracked ribs, and malnutrition. He should be barely ambulatory. Instead, he walked here under his own power and asked when he could return to duty. I have never seen anyone quite like him." But perhaps the most important aspect of Cain's actions wasn't the tanks he destroyed or the ground he held. It was the example he set for his men.
Leadership in combat is about more than giving orders. It's about showing your soldiers that you share their dangers, that you ask nothing of them you wouldn't do yourself, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but action despite fear. Cain embodied this completely. Every time Cain picked up a PIAT and moved forward to engage a tank, he was telling his men that their lives mattered more than his comfort or safety. Officers who lead from the rear can give competent orders, but they never inspire the kind of devotion that Cain generated. His men would have followed him anywhere because they knew he would never send them somewhere he wouldn't go first. There's a documented incident from September 22nd that perfectly illustrates this. A young private, barely 19 years old, had been assigned to carry PIAT ammunition. This is probably the most dangerous job in the perimeter short of actually firing the weapon because ammunition carriers had to move through open ground under fire. The private had frozen, paralyzed by fear, unable to move forward. Another officer might have threatened him, might have ordered him forward under threat of court-martial. Cain did neither. He walked over to the private, took the ammunition from him, and carried it forward himself. Then he came back, looked the private in the eye, and said simply, "Now you know it can be done. Next time, you'll do it." The private not only carried ammunition after that, he volunteered for it. He survived the battle and later said that Major Cain's simple act of leadership changed his entire military career. He went on to serve with distinction through the rest of the war. Cain did this repeatedly. When morale wavered, he was there. When men doubted, he showed them through action. When fear threatened to overwhelm soldiers, his presence steadied them. He created a bubble of competent calm around himself, and everyone within that bubble fought better because of it. His company sergeant major, a veteran of North Africa and Sicily, later stated, "I've served under a lot of officers. Good ones, bad ones, brave ones, cowards. Major Cain was different. He was the bravest man I ever knew, but he wasn't reckless. Every risk he took was calculated, every action had a purpose. And he never, ever asked us to do something he hadn't already done himself. Men like that are rare. I'd have followed him into hell if he'd asked. As the battle wore on and ammunition became critically scarce, Cain developed new tactics that would later be studied in military academies. When PIAT bombs ran low, he began rationing them, using them only on high-value targets like tanks and self-propelled guns. For other threats, he improvised. He discovered that German half-tracks, while armored, were vulnerable to concentrated small arms fire if you knew where to aim. The vision ports were weak points, the fuel tanks were exposed. The ammunition storage could be set off by tracer rounds if you were lucky and accurate. Cain directed his men to engage half-tracks with focused fire on these vulnerable points, and succeeded in destroying or disabling several without expending precious PIAT ammunition. He also pioneered what would later be called ambush by concealment. Instead of hiding from enemy tanks, which often meant being found and destroyed, Cain positioned himself in plain sight but disguised as rubble or debris. German tank commanders, scanning for threats, would look right past him because their brains registered him as part of the destroyed landscape. Then, when the tank had passed and was presenting its vulnerable rear armor, Cain stood up, fired, and scored a direct hit on the engine compartment. The tank stopped immediately. Before the crew could react, Cain had reloaded and fired again, this time at the ammunition storage. The resulting explosion was so violent that it killed the entire crew instantly. German reports mention this engagement specifically, describing it as hinterhältig, underhanded or treacherous. This is important because SS troops, the supposedly elite soldiers of the German military, were complaining that British tactics were unfair. Think about that. Veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had seen and done terrible things in the name of conquest, were lodging complaints about one British officer fighting too effectively. Cain's actions had strategic implications far beyond his immediate sector. Every tank he destroyed was one less tank available for the broader German counteroffensive. Every day his sector held was another day that other parts of the perimeter could reorganize and strengthen. Every German unit committed to crushing his position was a unit not being used elsewhere. German forces at Arnhem were operating on a tight schedule. They needed to eliminate the British perimeter quickly so they could redeploy to face other Allied threats. The longer the British held, the more German resources were tied down, resources desperately needed elsewhere. Cain's stubborn defense contributed significantly to this delay. Historians have calculated that the German forces committed to the Arnhem sector during Operation Market Garden included approximately 20,000 infantry, 100 armored vehicles of various types, and substantial artillery support. These forces were essentially pinned in place for 9 days by fewer than 10,000 British paratroopers, later reduced to fewer than 3,000 effective combatants as casualties mounted. The Germans expected to eliminate the perimeter in 2 to 3 days. It took them 9, and even then only succeeded because the British withdrew voluntarily. Every extra day bought time for other Allied operations. Every German casualty was one less soldier available for the defense of Germany itself. And in Cain's sector specifically, the German casualty rate was disproportionately high compared to other areas of the perimeter. A post-war analysis by the British Army's Lessons Learned Department specifically cited Cain's actions as an example of how individual initiative and tactical flexibility could amplify defensive effectiveness. The report noted that Cain's methods, while born of desperation and limited resources, represented genuinely innovative approaches to anti-armor warfare that deserved broader study and implementation. We need to acknowledge that Cain's heroics came at a price, and not just to himself. The soldiers under his command suffered casualties at a high rate, though notably lower than might be expected given the intensity of combat in their sector. Approximately 60% of Cain's company became casualties during the battle, killed, wounded, or captured. This was actually below the division average of nearly 80% casualties. But every casualty weighed on Cain.
Soldiers who served with him noted that between engagements, when there was a brief lull in the fighting, Cain would personally check on his wounded men. He would ensure they had whatever medical care was available. He would write down names and messages for families back home, knowing that many of these men wouldn't survive to deliver the messages themselves. There's a particularly poignant account from a young lieutenant who was badly wounded on September 21st. As he lay in a crater, unable to move, with German infantry advancing, Major Cain appeared seemingly from nowhere, picked up the wounded officer and carried him to cover. The lieutenant weighed approximately 180 pounds, and Cain carried him nearly 200 yards under fire. The lieutenant later wrote, "I was certain I was going to die. The pain was incredible, and I could hear the Germans getting closer. Then Major Cain was there, covered in blood and filth, looking like something from a nightmare. He picked me up like I weighed nothing and ran. German bullets were snapping past us, and I could hear him grunting with effort, but he never slowed down. He got me to the aid station, made sure the medics had me, then turned around and went back toward the fighting. I never saw him again. I owe him my life." This wasn't an isolated incident. Multiple soldiers reported similar experiences. Cain seemed to have a personal mission to ensure that every man who could be saved was saved. He exposed himself to fire repeatedly to rescue wounded men, to drag them to cover, to give them a chance at survival. Make sure you hit that like button if you're appreciating this level of detail. It helps the algorithm show this content to more people who love real history, and it tells me that you want more deep dives like this. By September 25th, the situation was hopeless by any objective measure. The perimeter had shrunk to less than a square mile, ammunition was essentially exhausted, medical supplies were gone, food had run out days before. The weather had prevented resupply drops, and XXX Corps, though finally approaching, was still not in a position to relieve the pocket. Division headquarters made the only decision possible: withdraw across the Rhine under cover of darkness. The wounded who couldn't walk would have to be left behind. It was a bitter pill, abandoning men who had fought so bravely, but there was no alternative. The able-bodied survivors would attempt to filter back to Allied lines, one by one, using the darkness and rain as cover. Major Cain received his withdrawal orders and began organizing his men. But he made a decision that exemplified everything about his character. He would be the last man out. He would maintain defensive positions, continuing to fire and create the illusion of a manned perimeter until every soldier under his command who could walk had reached the river. As night fell on the 25th, the evacuation began. Small groups of paratroopers moved quietly toward the Rhine, navigating by compass and memory through a landscape they'd come to know intimately over 9 days of combat. German forces, exhausted by the prolonged battle, were less aggressive than they might have been, but they still maintained patrols and observation posts. Cain moved between positions, firing a few rounds from each, making the Germans believe the perimeter was still fully defended. He would fire from one location, quickly relocate, and fire from another. He kept this up for hours, a one-man deception operation that bought precious time for his escaping comrades. Around midnight, with most of his men across or in the process of crossing the Rhine, Cain finally began his own withdrawal. He was the last officer to leave his sector. He moved through the ruins of Osterbeek like a ghost, this deaf, half-blind, wounded man who had become a legend, slipping past German positions that were still trying to find and kill him. He reached the Rhine as dawn was beginning to break. The last boats were preparing to leave. Cain waded into the water, and hands reached down to pull him aboard. As the boat pushed off, he looked back at Arnhem, at the town where he'd fought harder than perhaps any soldier in British history, and witnesses say tears ran down his filthy, bloody face. Of the approximately 10,000 British soldiers who dropped at Arnhem, only 2,163 made it back across the Rhine. The 1st Airborne Division effectively ceased to exist as a fighting formation. It would take months to rebuild. Operation Market Garden, Montgomery's bold gambit to end the war early, had failed. But within that failure were countless examples of extraordinary courage. And among those examples, Major Robert Cain stood out.
German intelligence reports, captured after the war, make specific mention of Cain. One report, dated September 28th, 3 days after the evacuation, includes this passage. The British defense of the Oosterbeek perimeter was characterized by fanatical determination unusual even for airborne forces. Particular mention must be made of actions in the western sector where one British officer, identity unknown, single-handedly delayed our advance for several days through extraordinary effective use of anti-tank weapons. Despite multiple attempts to eliminate this individual, including direct artillery fire and air attack, he survived and is believed to have escaped. This level of individual effectiveness represents a significant tactical problem that requires further study. The officer they were describing was Robert Cain, and he hadn't just escaped. He'd walked out of hell with his head held high. In the days and weeks following the evacuation, as survivors were debriefed and battle reports compiled, the full extent of Cain's actions became clear. His fellow officers recommended him for the highest military honors. Soldiers who had served with him gave statements describing his courage and leadership. Even the Dutch civilians who had witnessed parts of the battle provided testimony about the tall British officer who couldn't be killed. The British military doesn't award decorations lightly, especially its highest honor. But in Robert Cain's case, there was never any doubt. His actions at Arnhem had been witnessed by dozens of soldiers, documented in official reports, and even acknowledged by the enemy. What he had done transcended normal combat gallantry and entered the realm of the extraordinary. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The full recognition of Cain's heroism, the medals and honors, the way his story would inspire future generations of soldiers, that comes in Part 3. And trust me, what happens next is just as remarkable as the battle itself, though in a completely different way. In Part 3, we'll cover Cain's life after Arnhem, the recognition he received, and perhaps most importantly, what his actions teach us about courage, leadership, and the human spirit. We'll also discuss how his tactics influenced post-war military doctrine and why his story remains relevant today. Make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on, because the conclusion to this story reveals a side of Major Cain that's even more impressive than his combat record. The way he handled fame, the way he viewed his own actions, and what he did with the rest of his life will surprise you. And if you're loving this content, make sure you're subscribed because we're constantly uncovering stories like this that deserve to be told. On March 2, 1945, 6 months after the Battle of Arnhem, Major Robert Cain was awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military honor. The citation detailed his destruction of 6 enemy tanks and 1 self-propelled gun using only light anti-tank weapons, his leadership under impossible conditions, and his constant exposure to enemy fire that inspired his men to fight to the end. But Cain's reaction to the award revealed his true character. His first response was to ask if the medal could be given to his entire company instead. He genuinely believed that any credit belonged to all the men who fought at Arnhem, not to him personally. When told the Victoria Cross was an individual award, he accepted it reluctantly, remaining uncomfortable with the attention throughout his life. After the war, Cain could have pursued any career he wanted, leveraging his fame and decorated status. Instead, he returned to his pre-war job at Shell Oil Company, specifically requesting assignments away from public attention. He wanted to be judged on his current work, not his past glory. More importantly, Cain dedicated himself to helping fellow veterans. He worked quietly, using his connections to find jobs for struggling veterans, visiting wounded soldiers in hospitals, and providing support to those wrestling with physical and psychological trauma. One veteran he rescued at Arnhem later wrote, "Major Cain saved my life at Arnhem, and then he saved it again in the hospital when I was ready to give up." Cain also became an influential teacher at military academies like Sandhurst, lecturing on leadership, tactics, and the moral weight of command. His talks weren't about glorifying war, but about the responsibilities of leadership and making life or death decisions under pressure. Students remember him as demanding but deeply credible. When he spoke about command, he was drawing on real experience. Robert Cain lived until 1974, passing away at age 65. Even in death, he deflected attention, requesting a simple funeral and asking that donations go to charities supporting disabled veterans rather than monuments. His Victoria Cross went to the Imperial War Museum, with a card in his own words. "This medal belongs to all the men of the 1st Airborne Division who fought at Arnhem. I merely had the honor of wearing it on their behalf."
Today, Cain's story continues to inspire. Military forces worldwide study his tactics as examples of urban warfare and anti-armor operations. Business schools use his example for crisis management and leadership under pressure. The U.S. Army's field manual includes a case study on his defense of Oosterbeek. In Arnhem, the Dutch people have never forgotten. There's a street named Major Cainstraat in his honor, and every September, locals place flowers at the street sign. The Airborne Museum at Oosterbeek preserves his story, and Dutch families have adopted graves in the cemetery, maintaining them and ensuring these stories never fade. Cain's story offers timeless lessons that transcend military context. First, true courage isn't fearlessness, it's action despite fear. Second, authentic leadership means sharing every danger with your followers and leading by personal example. Third, genuine humility makes leaders more effective, not less, by keeping them grounded and focused on what matters. Most importantly, Cain proved that one person can make a difference. One man, properly positioned and properly committed, changed the course of a battle. His actions had strategic implications far beyond his immediate sector, inspiring others to fight harder and endure longer. Perhaps the greatest lesson isn't about his 9 days at Arnhem, but the 30 years that followed. Cain could have spent decades basking in well-earned glory. Instead, he returned to ordinary work, helped others quietly, and deflected attention at every opportunity. This is the hardest part of heroism. Not the spectacular action, but the humble aftermath. The question Cain's story poses to each of us is simple but profound. When your moment comes, when circumstances demand more than you think you can give, when others are counting on you, what will you do? Will you find reserves of courage you didn't know you possessed? Will you act according to your values even when it's difficult? Robert Cain was an ordinary man who, when tested absolutely, proved to be absolutely true. To his values, to his duty, to his men, to himself. And in being true when it mattered most, he created a legacy that endures as long as people value courage, honor, and selfless service. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into one of World War II's most remarkable stories, please subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. And here's something to think about for next time. What if I told you there was another soldier at Arnhem whose story is almost as remarkable as Cain's, but who has been almost completely forgotten by history? That story is coming soon, so make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. Until next time, remember, heroes aren't born. They're forged in moments of choice, when ordinary people decide to do extraordinary things. Major Robert Cain recognized his moment and showed us what's possible when courage meets duty. His story ends, but his example endures. And that, perhaps, is the greatest victory of all. Don't let stories like this fade into history. Subscribe now, leave a like, and comment below with your thoughts. Tell us, could you have done what Major Cain did? Your interaction keeps these heroes' memories alive. Next time, I'll tell you about the British medic at Arnhem who performed amputations under fire with nothing but a penknife and saved 37 lives in a single night, and the Germans put a bounty on his head for it.